show, and this is another picture, but not in the show, in a competition of some kind. I think probably before judges. And I think we can cut the sound for the moment because
Everyone,
it's a special treat and get them stuck. Come on, dear dog. Sit, sit, no, sit, no, sit. Come on.
because this is the age everyone is. Now we've moved to Connecticut.
All right. This small picture shows my sister Hope, the oldest sister, who's the only sister remaining, on the left, then father, and Hope's grandfather, and then Betty, and then David, Hope's mother, Hope's father, and then me, probably the first year in college, or the last year in school.
So how
Right.
many years after you moved to Connecticut would you say this picture is taken?
Well, let's see now. We moved to Connecticut in 1917. I entered college in 1920, and I would say it was about the last year in high school. Right. I think that's as near as I can get to it.
Okay.
Father obviously was dressed for the hunt, and I was dressed, I would say, for a party, of which I was very fond.
These are a few pictures of the house there.
The Greenwich house had an enormous box bush confronting the little garden, and Hope, my sister, and Johnny Haynes were married, where Mother is sitting at the far end of this picture. I'm sorry you can't and on this side is the box bush, and here, partially buried, was a very large meteorite that had struck sometime in the distant past. If you passed too close to it, it would stop your watch.
Oh, good.
That's the.
How big was it?
It was as big as the top of this table. It made quite a noise when it got filled. There was a little pond right alongside the house, beyond the garden that is just you've just seen, and Mother planted this whole bank with daffodils, and the town used to come out to see them in the spring. They were really beautiful. The pond was bisected by a fence, and there was very large slapping turtles, and in the spring, all the way up from Long Island Sound, migrated eels on their way to breed in this pond and other similar ponds going upstream. And then when they had finished the breeding process, they would head back down to the ocean. But some of them made the mistake of letting the grass, every year letting the grass that they crossed in order to get down to the stream over the edge of the dam and the outlet. Some of them would always wait until the grass was too dry. Then they get stuck. And then we had real problems, because every dog that was loose, and they were all loose all the time, would go and roll in those dead eels.
Oh.
And that was an odor you couldn't accept at all under any conditions. So you had to stay to windward of them. And what is that? Oh, yeah. You know, that is just an apple tree blossoming in the back of the garden. And this is a house that at one point housed pigs. And right over here, but not quite visible, is a house that in the earliest days slaves were hidden in, a little house that slaves were hidden in by the sympathizers of the colored people. And the house, the farm was the old Thompson house, Thompson Farm, and 3 generations back they were on the, what was called the underground for giving slaves refuge. And this little house over here was that. Well, that's a view of the house coming up Stanwich Road from the direction of what finally turned out to be the dog kennels, which was the other half of the Thompson Farm when the Merritt Parkway was put through by the state and bisected it, and of course bisected Father's hunting territory. And hounds getting across that Merritt Parkway were always a great hazard, so he moved the kennels to the far side where the River Hills, which was the main fox hunting area, were located. And then when they avoided getting over the parkway, because the hunting grounds were no longer on the opposite side of the parkway when the hounds were kenneled at home. and mother's side a real sigh of relief when those 144 hounds, which was the number he'd had when he died, those hounds left her side.
How many
Because they
horses
were
did he-
noisy and sometimes smelly, like when the eels came down the stream. And that's all in that picture. And that's the same pond.
Is this the house that the
That's right. Now, it seems
slaves
to me to
were
be
hidden
that, but
in?
I just can't tell from that picture where it is. But that's the general location of
This is
it.
a little house
Yeah,
here.
that's
Is
the
that where
one. That's the one. And there was
slaves
a
were
little
hidden?
tiny iron pot stove, which I have, believe it or not, out in Arizona now. And there was as many as 20, maybe 21 or 2 people in that little house when the underground was really working hard, you know. And Guinea Road, which was the road right beyond this bunch of scenery here, right beyond that was Guinea Road, and that's where the eels migrated across but got stuck at. And the Guinea Road was named because of the number of Negroes from Guyana who were coming up on this pipeline for freedom, they call it.
And their final destination was Canada? or
Anywhere
something?
away from the Confederates. Anywhere, they dispersed all over the place, a lot of them in Kentucky. Didn't have to move any further because Kentucky was then, of course, very much on the side of the Confederates. And some of them, many of them, went into the Northern Army, who felt strongly, and then others who stayed in the South were so devoted to their families that they stayed and fought in the Confederate Army for the sake of their families. It's the way the relationship was with the good white people down in the South. The so-called trash that didn't react that way to niggers, and most of the abuses were from that kind of citizen. I think that's all I need on that.
Okay.
And this was an apple orchard, and it seems to me that I spoke yesterday of the time that Father rode up and disciplined your father because he was playing mumbly peg instead of picking apples, you know. And I think I have that on the other film, didn't I? But at any rate, just quick repetition. Father spoke, this was according to your father. My father spoke so severely to me, as David said, he spoke so severely to me that he made me step on my own hands. And that's that. And there was a really most productive vegetable garden, and this is where the hounds were first kennelled, and it's the old hen house, and there was a run for them in the back. They were put near the main house, which is over here.
Was this actually a productive farm? And then did he have any livestock
No, he
on
didn't
it?
farm in his sense of the word. He had things growing on it, and a beautiful garden, and a big grape arbor running like this, with the Delaware and Concord grapes. But he didn't farm it in any sense except to raise hay. And he did
For his
raise
horses.
hay. You know, he had so many horses there. And then there was always a certain mortality among horses if you kept them long enough. And that turned out to be the food of the hounds. When they died, they were fed to the hounds.
But he was working mainly, you said he got on the club train in the morning to go into New York.
Well, at that
into
time, he was president of the Kentucky Block Kennel Coal Company and the Ohio and Caney Valley Railway in Kentucky, and the Michigan, Mohawk, and Wolverine copper mines in the northern peninsula of Michigan. And it was to those mines that he wisely sent me to work in them on an assumed name for a year, and then down in the Kentucky coal fields for a year. In the mines, working first on the 3 towers, the 3 shifts, under the assumed name of John Young, and I was supposed to take that name and live in Chicago in a hotel and have myself paged as John Young, so I got used to it, so I wouldn't make a boo-boo.
And what was the purpose of having
The
you
purpose
go
of it
in
was
as
to
a-
have me shown no favoritism and not to know that I was the president's son. And the manager of the mines, whose name was Dengler, a German man, was told that the day he let that out, if he did, it would be the day he went on the highway.
Was it in that time that your stories, you mentioned a story about Wiggles McCoy of the Hatfield McCoy?
Well, no, that was
feud?
Kentucky. No, you see, the Hatfield-McCoy feud took place in Breathitt County, and I forget the name of the other.
Why was it named Bloody Breath of
Well,
Healing?
because of the feuding in it.
Huh.
The Hatfields and the McCoys just couldn't settle anything any more than the Jews and the Arabs could. And it was a lifelong thing. And those mountaineers were so close to having been in the background of England that they didn't say they fought each other. They made battle.
They made battle.
They made a battle.
Mm.
And there were lots of other old English expressions. And they lived way, way, way up the creeks. You couldn't get any.
This was in Appalachia, in the easternmost part of Kentucky.
Yeah, it was in the Blue Ridge Mountains, the Kentucky side of the Blue Ridge Mountains.
Mm-hmm.
And it was as colorful as it gets. And they had such a knack and a facility and such a big production of white moonshine whiskey that most of them, the men were supposed to have scars, ridges on their nose from drinking out of mason jars. And a lot of colorful things that happened on I went up time and again with a great big German oil driller because there was oil on the property too. And we would stop in a mountain cabin, you know, and the only real bed would be vacated by who knows who, and it had the Conshuck mattress, which you can't stay awake if you roll on it at all. You can't stay asleep because it makes so much noise. And Al was twice my size, and we both slept in that bed, not without difficulties. And it was a very colorful trip all taken together. But one occasion I remember we passed up a creek where they had been delivering by mules, two spans of mules. They were delivering nitroglycerin in a special wagon so that the glycerin could not be jarred. And driving up a creek bed without jarring the nitroglycerin took a very courageous man. And this man had misjudged, or the mules shied, with two teams of mules, 4 mules, 2 teams. And to make a long story short, they'd set the nitroglycerin off, and that was used for dropping down the drilled holes in the oil wells and opening up the ground. See, they would drop it down, then drop down something to set it off, and then it would open up and then the oil, if they were lucky, would come out to the top, otherwise they had to pump it out. But this fella, poor fella, was parts of him was in the trees on the side, and parts of the mules were around here and there, and the nitroglycerin just blew the whole thing. Carriages was, the wheels and everything were just blown apart. And occasionally that happened, and of course those boys were paid very high to take those drives. But it didn't do them much good if they made a mistake.
Did it right.
That's all on that. I think excepting the mining in the Kentucky Block Candle Coal Company, mined coal that was just in perfectly beautiful square chunks. It would never pop. And you could carve it on a lathe and so on. But the seam was only 17 inches wide. Everything above that was slate, nothing. So the miners, of whom I was one at that point, you'd have to lie on your side and operate a coal puncher. And a coal puncher was a compressed air arrangement, and it had a shaft like that, so you plunged back and forth. And those two ends were prongs. That was a coal puncher, and you lie on your side and keep the pressure. When it kicked back, you'd shove it down. When it kicked back, you'd shove it down. 17 inches. See.
I bet your leg got tired.
Oh, I mean, it was killer, and the men were paid $2 a day for it in company script. Nothing. Couldn't
Not
cash.
in cash.
Had to cash it in the company store. It was all wrong and all changed now. And the mines, the coal got out of the mines by means of small mules that could get down underneath the slate. And we never stood upright in the mines at all. And it was a miserable way to live, but there it was. And they always had a rag turned tight over one eye of the mule, so that when he was in the mine, they could take the rag off and he could see where he was, and he wouldn't keep barking his head and his ears on the slate, you know. And then when he came out, they'd close this eye so he'd have a good one he could see with when he got back underground. And with this eye, he would go to the tipple, and then the cars were such that they would tip over into it, and that was loaded right onto a freight car, which was a part of the Ohio and Kentucky and Caney Valley Railroad. And that's about it on the mines. I fired the engine as a fireman for a while and was on as a brakeman, and there was a fellow, a member of the engine crew, whose name was Trigger. And the trigger was because he was about 5 feet tall, and he was the meanest little man and the most foul-spoken little man I think I ever saw. But you didn't let on about things like that with Trigger.
Was this Trigger McCoy?
This was Trigger McCoy, and he was always armed, and he was always ready for any Hatfield. But the thing that he looked forward to most, even more than one of the Hatfields, was if we should run over a sow or a pig.
With the train?
With the train, and the train engineer would automatically stop, and out would go Trigger with a gunny sack, and he would pick up the pieces and put them in the gunny sack, put them on the floor in the caboose, and that's where all of us had to have what lunch we had, with us, mostly biscuits and stuff like that. So there was the pig in pieces in a gunny sack all over the floor, and Trigger was just as pleased as Punch. Not far from the table, I tell you, they were really funny. I think I don't remember anything that's particularly worth repeating beyond that. I know that firing a freight engine in a country that's full of small tunnels, and some of them not so small, the engineer invariably would call for steam right when you started into the tunnel, because the tunnels were up like that and down, you see. And firing soft coal into a coal-burning engine, under those conditions, you were just about ready to not be able to do anything anymore, let alone fire the engine. But when you got to the other end of the tunnel, and then you got a bit of fresh air, and then, oh God, here's another tunnel, and the same thing over again. So it was a rough deal all the way around, and there was a certain way to bounce the heel as you went, when you threw it into the firebox, to bounce the heel on the rim of the firebox that would automatically spread the coal.
It was sort of a shovel that you...
It was a big shovel, a great big shovel, a coal shovel, and the firebox was elliptical like that, you see. So if you hit it just right, you bounce the heel.
Scatter.
And now if you shoved it in, as a greenhorn would do, just shoved a shovel full of coal in and it landed in a pile, then you had to take a very heavy clinker bar, and it wouldn't be long before there was a big clinker in there, and it wouldn't give you the steam you needed. So you'd have to break it up with a clinker bar, and you pretty soon began to learn about bouncing the shovel, as the boys called it. That's all I can remember about that.
Okay.
No, we
I
did it.
think these are mostly duplicates, but we'll just hold them on the camera.
Oh, yeah, well, you hold them, you hold
But
them
you-
steady. Give them
If
the
you
boys back.
remember anything as
Oh,
we go
well,
along,
yeah,
we're
that's
still
right.
in
Well,
Connecticut on the edge of the pond that the eels sometimes didn't get out of
Yeah,
before the
that's
grass
all,
got too high.
obviously all in spring. There's the same picture, the same
garden.
garden. This is where the horses were kept, some of them, the rest of them down on the other end in the old British farm, which was part of the total purchase. And Will and Lolly Myers, the former coachman at one of the mines, the former head coachman at one of the mines in Michigan, came, and he eventually married our German governess, who came over from Switzerland with great courage at 17 to our family, and came down to Kentucky, where all the other help was black. And she was with us until she died at 82, and so was Will Myers. And they lived in a little apartment here, and then eventually they had their own little house, which Father bought for them. That's the garden in the background. Same thing. Just one of the big apple trees at the entrance to
I
the...
think that might be an arbor in there?
That's right, at the entrance to the garden, I think it was. But that is the grape arbor with Delaware and Concord grapes.
So it seems to be two rich.
Yeah, that's right, and there's the daffodil plantation again with a pond, and that's that. And here is the back veranda, no, it's a little part of the front veranda of the house. Let me see it just a moment. There was a cistern right here, but I think that by then was covered up. It's the same house.
Again,
Garden,
probably
yeah.
that, and we've seen this one.
That's the garden with the box bush here, we've seen that.
And this is a better picture.
This is a better picture of the box bush, said to be the oldest in Connecticut, and I expect it was. It was enormous and quite frost tender, so it all had to be covered up. And I think when we sold the place, that covering up wasn't done, and it really destroyed the size of the bush. So,
Okay.
oh, excuse me, that's, oh gee, is that possible, Ross? Can you get it from the front meadow looking toward Mount Monadnock, which is hidden back of the house? Mount Monadnock was a beautiful symmetrical mountain like Fuji in Japan, and it was the great favorite of the man who lived on Walden Pond.
Thoreau.
Thoreau. So this was a house that Uncle Joe built, not built, bought, quite old in parts. This was one of the original buildings in Jaffrey Center. It was a gunsmith shop. And the house itself was enlarged in various ways, and it was Uncle Joe Chaffee's, Uncle Joseph Gay's substitute for a yacht. He said he wasn't going to have a yacht, but he would have this instead. And it had miles of beautifully done stone walls built by an Irishman and his 3 sons. And they're still there. They were so balanced that they're still there. Now this is a picture of Uncle Joseph Gay, whose sister died when her 3 little girls were very young, and he adopted them all. He was an old bachelor. He lived in the Union Club, which moved from Brooklyn over to Fifth Avenue, Lower Fifth Avenue, and lived there all his life. And he owned mines in Michigan and mines in Kentucky and railroads. And some, unfortunately, he owned land in Canada, which has been quite a millstone around the family's neck, because it's very hard to do anything with mines, and they proved not to have any mineralization in them. He was as generous as they come. He died in 1914, and it was his estate that was being so mismanaged that my father, Hope's grandfather, had to sell his farm and go north and take charge, because the management of the mines and the railroads under one man was being bled all the time by the man putting his hand in the till. And I think I spoke of Mr. Stanton, didn't I?
Yes.
Well, that ended tragically for Mr. Stanton, but father had to take over the mines, and then I was sent to learn the copper business, and he had a premonition that he wouldn't live long, and he did die when he was 49, and I had been by that time initiated into the mysteries of mining as much as one could be. The miners with whom I worked for the most part, Cornishmen. They're the best miners in the world. I think really, truly they are. All the mines in Michigan had Cornish captains. And I, at one point, lived in a Finnish boarding house in a double deck with another Finn. And I was on a different shift from him, fortunately, because while I was on shift one night and he was asleep, he was stabbed. Yeah, and I might have been in the bunk instead if I'd been on a different shift. He was stabbed. And that was a Finnish boy.
And then he was dead?
I don't remember whether he covered or not, but he was a Finn, so he probably did. Yeah. The Finns fed you potatoes and meat, potatoes and meat, potatoes and meat, and believe me, working underground as a trimmer and shoveling loose stone off loose stone, if you didn't have solid, what they call solid, big plank platform, into the mine cars, and they were run, of course, by electricity, not mules, but some of the mines did have mules that spent their lives underground, and every 6 months were up the shaft, and being drawn up, and then their eyes were covered with burlap for about a week or 10 days, or they would have lost their sight. But for the most part, it was electrically done. And just for variety, I worked in the old Quincy mine at Houghton, Michigan, which went down at an angle of about 67 degrees, and went down to a depth of just over 10,000 feet. It was the deepest mine in the country, and I don't think there was anything much deeper. And the temperature of the rock at the bottom of that mine was 104. And when you got down to the bottom, when I was working with it, and it was only a week, you went out almost 2 miles from the bottom of the shaft, and the only air that came in through big, about maybe 2 feet in diameter, like that, big canvas tubes. And the machinery was old, and the tubes were shot full of holes by blasting, And the only way to get rid of the gasoline, the dynamite smoke, was through those tubes. And you couldn't go into that particular drift, or shaft, or tunnel rather. You couldn't go into that, at least I couldn't, without coming out with the worst kind of headache in the world, which is a dynamite headache. Just from those fumes, they were lethal, and just like an accordion, your head would go. And a man of my weight would lose about 5 pounds each shift, in just in sweat, you know, into his boots. So it was a rough go, that mine, and they had tried Mexican miners because they thought they'd stand the heat better. Well, they did. They stood it by just sitting around. The best miners they ever got were great big Russians. Yeah, and I worked for them, but mostly with the Finns. And the Finns had a peculiarity. They are a sullen, like their big dark forests. They're a sullen people. Working with a crew of 6 other trammers, that is the fellows who'd shovel the rock, working with a crew of 6 others, all shift long, they would not say a word in English. They could speak English just as well as I could. The one thing they did do, though, they were a little generous in this way. They used to let me have a pinch of snuff, which they called nuska. Nuska, and that's about as near as we ever got to getting friendly. Then I moved out of a Finnish boarding house and moved into a Cornish boarding house with one of the captains, the old mine captains. And they gave me things that were, I'll never forget how good they were, Cornish pasties. It's like an apple turnover, but full of meat and vegetables. And that was the lunch. And I'll tell you, it really did the job. And that's all I can remember. And I think you better cut.
Whose house that he had instead of a
As
yacht?
it began to be enlarged with fancy things like this porch. That's all on that. And this is the farm tenant house down by the edge of Gilmore Pond, which was about a mile long and maybe 3/4 of a mile, and all the drinking water came out of that pond. Beautiful pond.
This is one of the walls that the Irishman and his 3 sons made.
Exactly, yeah. Danny something, I forget his name now.
It looks very tall.
Well, it's a poplar.
I mean the wall.
Oh, yes, it is. It's breast high.
I mean, our walls are about
Breast
half
high,
of
and they're
that.
still there after all those years.
Almost have twice as many rocks as we do. Or they were twice as good at picking them
Another
up.
view for the farm in the background, I think. And that is Mount Monadnock, but not showing it to be anything because it's too misty, but it sloped up both ways. And that's where your father, dear, had a heart attack about 3/4 of the way up. You remember that?
Yes, that was
Right.
terrible. My first.
We went there in the summers for the
Life.
Kimball, with the Kimball family, from their pictures here, and were raised more or less with them. And this is looking down from the house on Gilmore Pond, which goes straight that way for a mile, then off like that for about a half a mile, and in the middle was about 98 feet deep,
Oh, my
spring fed,
goodness.
wonderful water. And we
Wow.
learned to swim there and canoe and this and that.
Did your father come also? Come with you?
Yes, he came, but father wasn't much on swimming, and he could swim
There weren't
all
any
right.
horses or dogs, so.
He didn't have any horses or dogs, and he took a
Instead
dim
of
view
misery.
of the fields that he saw, which were strewn with boulders, a dim view of that. And I remember he didn't like the kind of weather that sometimes seemed to greet him when he came, a northeast storm. It would last 3 days. And it caused him to remark one time, I remember, that in this kind of weather you couldn't even get a jack to breed a jenny. Raise mules, you see. That's a twist in the road going down to down to old man Hodges' house, where we had great fun at night fishing for that peculiarity of New England, the horned pout. Horned pouts are catfish of a kind, with same stickers outside, like a mustache, and you fished for them in old Mr. Hodges' pond, and there was always a chorus of great horned owls. It's fascinating.
Why did you fish at night?
That's the time they bit.
Huh?
They wouldn't bite otherwise. They stayed down on the bottom when the sun was out.
It's one of the stone walls.
Yes, that's the same.
This is
That I don't know
A
what
road
it is.
just
It's
between
an
those
old road,
lines.
and that was the only kind of road there was. And Uncle Paul, he was coming up shortly. Uncle Paul Kimball, who married Aunt Ann, you know, mother's sister, your grandmother's sister. He had a great big Pierce Arrow car.
Mm.
And he would come through those roads with more skill as a driver than I ever saw anyone. He loved that Pierce Arrow. And it was a big one, and it was at the time when it had its headlights fed by an acetylene tank on one of the running boards. So it went back a little way, but it was a
that like
Dango
a
car,
V8 engine or?
12 cylinder. Inline. It was a
Well,
big car.
they had such a long hood out front.
That's what they certainly did have, and he was crazy about it. Pierce Arrows, that's all he had for quite a little while. Now, let's go ahead.
On the back of this is written, Auntie and I, first trip abroad, winter spent in Dresden.
Now, that's your grandmother. Speaking of her sister, Aunt Kimball, of course. You want to answer that phone, honey?
Well,
We better cut that.
Okay.
Called Mrs. Bogardus' boarding school for young ladies. And this is one of the young ladies.
this is your mother.
Oh, this is my mother, yes, and this is Aunt Ann Kimball, her younger sister. And in this picture, it's the same school, and it's your grandmother and one of the other students there.
Okay.
And Mrs. Bogardus was very gifted as a person with other people, and the little girls, some of them naturally in any group of youngsters, some would be terrified of thunderstorms. And those who were known to be terrified would be allowed to come and get in her bed. And that reassured them and it comforted them. And they were there in the boarding school, for I think several years, and then your grandmother, my mother, came, went over to Bryn Mawr and went to college there. And that's where she and the actress Katharine Hepburn first met each other. They were roommates, as you probably knew. And this is the Kimball family. On the left, Dr. Paul Kimball, who was a gynecologist.
Now, how is he related to your mother?
He married her sister. That is Aunt Ann Kimball, who was Aunt Ann Hosford. Mother was Elizabeth Hosford. And they had 3 children, of whom I only see 2 there. Oh yes, this one was it. Well, the boy is Paul Kimball, and then Anstis and Joy. Anstis being the younger. And that's the Kimball family. And he didn't continue with his practice of medicine, unfortunately. He went to Amherst. He didn't continue medicine, and he went to farming. And he didn't know farming, he did know medicine. And he paid a heavy price for that, because farming down on the North Shore of, down on the Chesapeake Bay in Maryland, was a tricky business because it was tidewater. And Father could advise him to a certain point, but he didn't make out. And then he came back, and up here he made a number of, in Jaffrey that is, he made a number of very good changes and alterations and installed heat. And several of the children were born in Jaffrey. And
In
of course,
that house?
in that house, right in that house. He was a fine man, and he was only 67 when he died. And I think he died of a stroke or a sudden heart arrest on a train coming into Boston. And that's all on that picture, I think. And that's your grandmother and her desk in Greenwich in the house there. And she loved small things like, there's one of the old Cape Cod, famous Cape Cod baskets, you know. And things like this she was very fond of. And then this little piece of a Robert Emmons Owen picture that she cherished. She had a number of them. And the picture that I have of the house in Arizona is one that he painted. I think you have 2 of them, possibly 3 here.
Do you think she was happier living in Connecticut? Did it suit her?
Well, she always went
background
north
better?
in the summers and went to Nantucket and took such children as were then on deck, as it were, with her. Always went to Nantucket.
She
We
sort of
sometimes
hated
went
the
to
heat
Jaffrey.
in Kentucky, the
Well,
weather,
the
or-
heat and just to give them a change, but mostly for the heat. And then she wanted us to have a real feeling for Connecticut. And that little town in northeast Connecticut, Thompson, had quite a background, quite a history. And it was quite near a lake that has a name that has more letters in it than any name anywhere, Indian or otherwise, in this country. They chagagagog, man chagagog, chabalagangamog. 42 letters. Chagagagog, man chagagog, chabalagangamog. And it's a great big lake about 4 miles from Thompson.
Did
She
anyone
always-
ever know what it meant?
Oh, sure, the Indians knew to begin with, and we figured it out as well, but I don't know what the translation was.
No.
It's quite a long sentence when you get it translated, but the Indians put it all together, one word. Yeah.
If you were going there, you probably had to leave extra time to tell somebody where you were going.
You would be. Signs were a problem too. That's the 2 Kimball girls and Wolf, the fine police dog that they had at one point. And I think the next one
This is the last picture that
is the
we have,
last
actually.
picture, and that's the Thompson Church. And Mother loved Thompson and was raised there more or less, and had many friends, and some of them went to Bryn Mawr. And Uncle Joe, of course, was raised there. And Uncle Joe Chafee, her sister, her Uncle Joseph Gay, rather. Uncle Joseph Gay was the principal teller of the bank there. And Joe Chafee, he was his great uncle, Joe's great uncle. He has a number of the banknotes that were signed by him. Those days, the individual banks issued their individual notes. And I think that's about it, excepting such recollections as, occur about dead woodchucks and other things that pester a rather impressive little boy. It was a nice place, had lovely apples there.
And where did a dead woodchuck impress you?
Down in the orchard when I came on him suddenly, and I wasn't used to things like that at that point. I don't know why, living on a farm. I think I can't remember anything more than, if I do, it'll be too late. So I guess we'll
Identify him. Start with this one. This
I
is
should
the
think
Lunsford,
we
and this
might.
is his brother, David. That's right.
So it says on the back. A photo of Dr. David W. Yandell at 63. Now that is your grandfather.
No, that's my great-grandfather. No, that's my great-uncle. And this is
That's
my
right. That's right.
great-grandfather.
I can get pretty badly mixed, so you're going to have to
Okay.
remember some of this on your own.
All right,
Okay.
but these are the 2 doctors.
That's right.
Right.
That's right.
Okay, so you tell it just really briefly, that story about these 2 brothers who were doctors, and one was in the Civil War.
Yeah, that's right.
One was in charge of taking care of all the troops,
Aren't
and
you
the other
in a
was.
position so you can hold the pictures for him,
That's what's
and I
happening
can
right
pass
now.
the pictures to you?
Well, we need for you to talk, because this
Oh,
is being
I'm sorry, but
recorded.
you just take the pictures. I'll take the pictures and
I
see
know,
what
but-
they are, and then you hold them for the photographing. Can't you do that?
Can you just tell who these people are while I'm holding them and he's photographing them?
Certainly.
Okay.
Mhm. I'll
So
figure that
tell a
out.
little bit. We're doing it now. The camera is running now, okay?
Well, I should
So
rather
I'm
hope not,
asking
because it's pretty
you
dispersed. Ross,
to
you're not taking
tell.
pictures now, are you?
Yeah, I have the photographs and
You have?
Yeah, and it's recording you talking now and me talking now. And this,
All
and
right.
please start telling about these 2 brothers, okay?
It's going to be, okay, I'm glad you're going to preside over the showing of these pictures, because, calling on your memory is a very unsteady proposition.
That's all right.
And,
We'll have some good surprises. We'll remember some good stories.
There are
on
going
them.
to be some surprises. I don't know how good they're going to be, but I'm not yet at the point of being in the position of the man who was talking to an elderly friend, and he said, "I'm having a terrible time with my memory. I can't hardly remember anything at all. Like I can't remember if it was you or your brother-in-law that died first." Well, comfort yourself, anyone who is unfortunate.